Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm David Blight, Director of the Gilder Lehrman Institute for the Study of Slavery and Abolition. This is our first GLC Wednesday at lunch for this fall. There will be many to come, including soon. Well, I won't name them all right now. Perhaps Michelle Sachs will. We're using a new room here in the Rosencrantz building. It's well equipped. Tomorrow, Michelle, who helps run our education program, is also now our newest and quite skilled technician who set all of this up. I want to thank her for that. And thanks to Melissa and Michelle for setting up everything today. We even have some goodies here. We got granola bars, we got cookies. I don't know what you're having out there, but we're doing fine. We're really pleased to welcome our German fellow from the Bavarian American Institute in Munich. This is an agreement, an arrangement that I made years ago. It's got to be at least 15, possibly 18 years ago, with Klaus Benisch, a former colleague of mine in Munich, who used to direct the Bavarian American Academy. And so we get at least one fellow every year from Germany, usually from Munich, who is a PhD student working on some aspect of American history, American studies, American literature. And this year's is Hanna Sophia Hörl from the University of Munich, where she did her BA and her MA and is now doing her PhD. It's a place I once spent a full year as a Fulbrighter, a place I know well, although the regime of faculty there have now changed. That stuff happens. She's been a research fellow here in the States at least twice, once at Radcliffe, the Schlesinger Library in Cambridge. And she also did a fellowship or a research visit to both Trinity College in Dublin and Santa Barbara City College in California. So she's a lot of experience here in the US as a researcher and a fellow. Her project is entitled Looking Back to June Jordan, How Spatial Justice Discourse Has Taken Form in African American Literature, Art, and Urban Design since the 1960s. This may reflect that Sophia also has a significant background in environmental studies. I'm not sure if the June Jordan project connects with that, but I suspect it does, yes. So a warm welcome, Sophia, and a warm welcome to all of you out there online and to our folks here in the room today. So over to you, Sophia. I'll come back in for Q&A in a little while, and I'll get off camera so this whole scene looks a lot better.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and hello and welcome to everyone who's here in person and online. I hope you can see us well. Yeah, first of all, just wanted to take a moment also to express my gratitude to the Gilder Lehrman Center, to Professor Blight, Michelle Sachs, and all the wonderful staff members who have made me feel so welcome here and who have been wonderful hosts thus far. And also a big thank you, of course, as David Blight mentioned, to the Bavarian American Academy for sponsoring this fellowship for the month of September. Now, just give me a moment so I can set up my presentation here, and then we'll get right into it. Okay. Can everyone see the presentation?
We have it.
Wonderful. Okay, so well, David gave already a little outlook on what I'm talking about today, but I wanted to just briefly start with a few words on June Jordan. It's probably needless to say who June Jordan is, but whenever I mention her name, at least in Germany, I get a few question marks about who she is. But I saw that the Black Studies department at Yale University even hosts an annual June Jordan lecture. So I'm sure people are very familiar with her work here at Yale. So June Jordan was actually a Jamaican-American poet, writer, activist, and urban planner. And it's safe to say her work has been misrecognized for a long time, and scholarly discourse around her work reignited in recent years, let's say in the last decade or so. And what made her so interesting to me is that she embraces the realms of literature, art, and urban design seemingly all at once. And therefore her literary and cultural interventions epitomize a certain junction and juxtaposition of provocative, visionary ideas and reality. So quickly going back, this talk is about part of my current research project, my dissertation at LMU Munich, looking back to June Jordan, how spatial justice discourse has taken form in African-American literature, art, and urban design since the 1960s. And so since writer and activist June Jordan carelessly challenged the public sphere to counter racial and spatial injustices, these issues particularly emerged then in her two texts here that I'm talking about today, the Esquire article, Skyrise for Harlem from 1965, and her young adult novel, His Own Where from 1971. So I quickly want to give you a brief overview, just a few words on my research goal and argument of this project, just to give you an idea. So the overall aim of this thesis is to examine how space, both imagined and real, relates to social, racial, and in parts as well as environmental justice, and how this plays out in the topography of a poem or novel, just as in constructed spaces in art and urban environment. And so I argue then that June Jordan's work and its contemporary counterparts, which I'll mention in a moment, in fiction, art, and urban design, each with their own means and strategies, for one, mobilize spatial justice discourse by blending literary texts and poetic language with art and or urban design, and thereby generate what I would call in-between spaces or counter spaces. They also stimulate and drive forward a sense of collective justice in form of literary and artistic spaces of refuge by moving the marginalized to the center of focus. And lastly, they also seem to serve as a tool of protest that may add to a sense of place and striving for justice through the written word and artistic practice. So the project consists of two parts. The first part is on visions of spatial injustice in literary landscapes. And I start out by looking at June Jordan's probably earliest literary commission, To Look at Me from 1969, an illustrated poem. And during my research, it turned out it shows very striking parallels to Claudia Rankine's 2014 now classic Citizen, an American Lyric. And the young adult novella, His Own Where, seems to be sitting between part 1 and part 2 of this project. So the second part here is on spatial justice discourses and urban design, from urban visions of racial uplift to Afrofuturist aesthetics. And here I'm looking at Skyrise for Harlem, and later on, I'm hoping to include a chapter on Walter Hood, for example, and his project Black Towers, Black Power from 2020. So other contemporary artistic practices and think pieces of urban design. So that just briefly about my research. So let's begin with June Jordan's Skyrise for Harlem from 1965. While it predates her literary works, Who Look at Me and His Own Where, Skyrise serves as a transition to explore the continuation from imaginations of spatial justice on the page to physical spaces, as well as their mutual entanglements. And I analyze Skyrise for Harlem from a literary point of view, as it in part certainly reads as a poetic text that combines written word with illustration and thereby mutually complements another, a combination that Jordan deemed as extremely valuable. And in this respect, it's essential, or it was essential for me to also take earlier unpublished drafts of this article into consideration to fully grasp the originally intended poetic quality of the article. And so a driving idea here is to consider that while literary text can create space, architecture builds space. So both similarly have the potential to interrupt or transform public discourse on spatial justice and therefore develop alternate worlds of possibility through both real and imagined space. And just here to begin with 2 short quotes from the final version of this article. No one will move anywhere but up a radical landscape, vast cleared ranges of space with 15 peaks rising into the sky. Harlem has not been designed to be set apart. All right, so the mid-1960s then constitute a turning point for June Jordan on many levels. It's the height of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, and having become witness to the Harlem Riots of 1964, after the killing of an African-American teenager, James Powell, by a police officer, a defining historical event for the Harlem community, Jordan herself decides to refrain from being fueled by hatred. And meanwhile, a growing fascination with architecture moves to Jordan's center of focus as she spends hours teaching herself about the power of architecture. And it soon becomes a tool of resistance and a call for action in her work, not least also as a way to cope and respond to the Harlem Riots. And Jordan herself observes, America was plunging, and I quote, America was plunging into a Holocaust confrontation based upon racist perception of Black everything is evil opposed to white everything is good. I found myself hooked on that way of looking at things. Architecture became an obsession. And so Skyrise for Harlem is a magazine article that first appeared under a different name, Instant Slum Clearance, in an April 1965 issue of Esquire magazine. And it is actually a collaboration with urban visionary and self-proclaimed philosopher of shelter, or utopian by necessity, as he has been called, Buckminster Fuller, who has risen to fame in years prior with his utopian ideas of geodesic domes. He made it onto the cover of Time magazine. So he was the main collaborator for this project, but the illustrations are yet by someone else, a Japanese-American illustrator called Shoji Sadao, geographer and cartographer. The subtitle here, it's hard to read on this scan, reads, Buckminster Fuller designs a total solution to an American dilemma. Here, for instance, is how it would work for Harlem. So Skyrise for Harlem presents different kind of primary texts. It's this speculative 2-page utopian environmental redesign article. The original title of Skyrise for Harlem was later renamed, as I mentioned, by Esquire, the self-proclaimed magazine for men, and this catered to a very specific target audience at the time. And with this predicament in mind, it already hints at a key dilemma that shall be addressed here in this talk as well, namely what I would call the poetic erasure of June Jordan's voice. So how does her utopian redesign plan of Harlem exactly look like? So Skyrise is centered around the idea of racial uplift through a literal elevation of its inhabitants through the creation of these 15 conical towers, as you can see here. And the prevention of crime should be aided through a change in urban design and enhanced infrastructure, moving away from the oppressive grid pattern, that, as she called it, and towards more concentric structures and open views. But with that question arises, whether a sense of racial and spatial justice can ever fully be achieved if at the same time culture, identity, and tradition of the African-American diaspora developed out of racial inequalities mirrored in spatial segregation. So aspects of African-American literary and art histories and also architectural traditions cannot simply be deconstructed to make way for entirely new structures of total freedom in a just society. Yet envisioning possible futures while also reflecting on the past is integral to evoking empathy amongst readerships, audiences, as well as the general public, and ultimately propelling change. Jordan was also actively tackling point 4 of the Black Panthers' 10-point program for self-determination. For example, point 4, which demands decent housing fit for shelter of human beings. And this proves that Skyrise indeed was an act of resistance in literary form and a product of the ongoing debates of the Black Power movement. There is a certain militancy in the article, which was also ascribed to the Black Panther Party, I would say. And this militancy can be read between the lines as Jordan deemed a total exorcism as necessary to ensure the racial uplift of Harlem. A half a century of despair requires exorcism, she writes. In one of her drafts, and I'll refer to some quotes here throughout the talk, it sounds a little bit different. She writes, "Renovation is not enough. Any piecemeal healing of debasement will prove mere symptomatic treatment, like a cough drop for tuberculosis. Half a century of squalor needs nothing less than curative exorcism." So here Jordan emphasizes the healing of Harlem, personifies the collective suffering that is experienced within the neighborhood that is mirrored in its urban design, and connects it to the idea of interrelating architecture also to medicine, with medicine. Now, I briefly want to mention a few concepts that I center within my chapter and in this talk. And these first 3 concepts are either coined by June Jordan herself. She calls her writing the poetry of form, which looks at this double function of the term form, which then again found its way into my overall title of the project. So it speaks to, for one, architectural form, but also poetry as a means to provide form as framework to build upon. Then scholar Cheryl J. Fish also coined a term uniquely in relation to Jordan's work called architecture, like a neologism, if you will, that elucidates the mutual entanglements and functions of architecture and text. She writes, it can be defined as a scaffold on which to build a vision of hope and embodied environments. And lastly, Davy Nittel coined the term literary counterplanning in relation to Jordan's work. They write, Jordan figures poetry the way she figures the imaginative work of planning. Both are forms of invention that are committed to telling the truth by seeking emotionally precise descriptions of the relation between space, social frameworks, and their emotional effect. So there, as you can tell, there seems to be something quite unique going on with Jordan's work if people come up with new words to describe what she's doing. Beyond, I think, 2 other concepts, even though you might be familiar with, the second one is a subaltern Black American counterpublic, coined by Houston Baker. I'm sorry, Houston Baker, who's riffing off of Nancy Fraser's term of the subaltern counterpublic. And to him, he said the Black civil rights struggle, and particularly during the decade of 1955 and 65, exemplifies the active working of the imagination of the subaltern Black American counterpublic. And he really puts emphasis on the idea that imagination should be understood as a social practice. And something I'll refer to later on is the term Afrofuturism. You probably are familiar with that, but I'm drawing it from here. Mark Derry. Interestingly, the term was coined way after Jordan and Fuller wrote this article, and yet there are certainly some elements that can be identified as Afrofuturist characteristics. So Derry says it's a speculative fiction that treats African-American themes and addresses African-American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture, and more generally African-American signification that appropriates images of technology and a prosthetically enhanced future. what's interesting was also his question that he's asking in this relation, can a community whose past has been deliberately rubbed out and whose energies have subsequently been consumed by the search for legible traces of its history imagine possible futures? Now, let's elaborate though a little bit more on what Jordan called her poetry of form. It refers to the idea of combined poetry and architecture, as I mentioned, in a medium made accessible to most people, as she writes herself. But as I mentioned, the text was significantly altered upon publication, undergoing what I term poetic erasure, and this is kind of epitomized in the title change here too. But also a sense of collectivity was in large part stripped away from the final version of the publication, as was the team effort under which the project idea was created. So the strive for spatial justice in a community effort was largely edited out, and it constitutes one of the central reasons as to why this piece, I would say, did not work the same way His Own Where or Who Look at Me did a few years later. However, the published version of the article, titled Slum Clearance, also stripped away a considerate amount of Jordan's poetic vision for poetry of form, focusing instead on the more literal aspects of urban redesign. And Esquire's final version, as you saw, attributed the project primarily to Fuller and sidelined Jordan's poetic vision and critical role. The final article veils the image of the technical sublime that Jordan and Fuller's version of Skyrise also exudes in an imagery of a seemingly natural environment that envisions to resemble organic shapes like trees. And this metaphoric imagery does not necessarily match the illustrations that accompany the text, even though they facilitate the imagination of what future Harlem might look like. But what Jordan originally called Skyrise reflected her poetic and artistic approach to urban redesign. So in her early drafts, Jordan used metaphors like describing Harlem as a life dying inside a closet to convey how spatial segregation and racial injustice stifle potential. She saw Harlem's confinement as a broken branch disconnected from the natural world. And her draft suggested that Harlem's future should be one of transformation, with columns supporting clouds of life, flying islands, hanging gardens, symbolizing the potential of growth and liberation. And some poetic metaphors relating to environmental redesign remained in the final version, such as comparing these conical skyrise buildings to towering trees of life, or calling Skyrise for Harlem a tree town. So the poetic language was, as you see, integral to her vision to reshape the urban environment into a model of racial and spatial injustice. So this shift then highlights the challenges Jordan faced as a Black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated world of architecture. And the revisions reflect how her more radical and poetic vision was erased to fit a mainstream expectation. Despite this, Jordan's original work, combining architectural innovation with political activism, remains a vital part of her legacy, of course. So here, scholar Debbie Niddle's concept of literary counterplanning comes into play again as it presents this alternative vision for Harlem that serves as a form of resistance to urban renewal and intervention for spatial justice. And after all, Jordan's Skyrise provides a critical lens for understanding this intersection of architecture, literature, and spatial justice, because the relationship between text and architecture creates this meaningful space of resistance. And sorry, 1 second. So for Jordan, Skyrise wasn't just an architectural project, it was a vision for transformation, future Harlem, where past struggles for justice could coexist with hope for a better future. However, Jordan's vision faced criticism, though, too, particularly regarding her approach to erasing Harlem's cultural history. So scholar Danielle Matlin argued that by focusing on renewal, Jordan overlooked Harlem's legacy as a cultural hub for Black Americans, accusing Jordan of what he terms rhetorical erasure. So I'm trying to counter that a bit with the term poetic erasure here. It addresses this interdependency between the physical and the rhetorical erasure of a place, in the case of Harlem's past, with all its symbolical relevance and its positive and negative connotations and resonations as Black cultural capital in the US. So while Jordan's vision aimed to transform Harlem, she did in fact acknowledge the importance of community participation. And she believed that meaningful involvement from Harlem's residents was crucial for any transformation. But this element was ultimately also removed, as I mentioned. So she argued, though in her drafts, you cannot hope to rebuild the reality of people unless meaningful participation by the intended beneficiaries is pre-designed. And now looking here at the second illustration of the final article in Esquire, you can see like a cross-section of one of these seemingly humongous conical towers. For scale, you have Harlem of the 1960s here on the bottom, but then you have well, an illustration that mainly focuses on the architecture, but also where the cars would go, where the highways would be, because that is still quite central in this article as well. And then on the other side, you see a fairly small floor plan of how an apartment within these conical towers would look like. And what poet Evie Shockley notes here is she goes so far as to point out that even Sadow's illustrations do not give Jordan's vivid descriptions justice visually either. And she observes that they're completely devoid of human presence and featuring skyrises more evocative of nuclear silos than tree towns. And so the reimagined Harlem seen by Esquire's readers hardly looks inviting. Now, returning to Afrofuturism, connected to Skyrise, Jordan's work resonates with broader themes of Afrofuturism, where imagination and technology merge to create more equitable spaces. She believed that new technologies could help create a more humane environment. As she put it, we can change the world, or we can permanently surrender the right on our spaceship Earth. And the vision for Harlem was futuristic, blending architecture with social justice to create spaces where communities could thrive. And maybe for, due to time constraints, I just want to point out one, but I want to talk about those two quotes because they seem to be spot on visions of what we have today. So for one, it's Fuller's vision of a so-called two-way TV that facilitates the certain arrival of new teaching techniques. So this is what we're doing right now, right soon. And then the second quote, which made me laugh almost, is that constant referendum becomes possible when the citizen at home can transmit the reaction that he likes it or he doesn't like it in response to the overwhelming number of governmental acts reported every day. This yes or no readily translates into a language of computers. Democracy may thus become a manifestly practical and appropriate form of government in our space age of technology.
Wow.
So
What year was that written, that quote?
this from 1964.
That's amazing.
So I just found that interesting because
Yeah.
this thumbs up, thumbs down mentality like holds such a grip over us daily
I
on
like
social
the
media. Yeah, but here it was thought of as like a way to facilitate decision-making processes and make it easier for all of us to be part of this democracy. But Skyrise could never unfold its full potential, as we all know. Its significance, though, as a literary intervention for spatial justice echoes from the era that brought forth the Black Power movement to times of the Black Lives Matter and beyond, as it continues to regain interest in our present. The stamping it as a mere failure would surely not do it justice. Journalist Claire Schwartz said the world that produced the urgent need for a Skyrise for Harlem was the same one that foreclosed its realization. Here you can see an installation view of a 2018 exhibition called Never Built New York, and Hai Sung tried to include all these projects that were never realized in his installations.
Did you get to see that?
No, at that point, I didn't even know about it. But there's a book about this out, so I need to look at it. And I want to complete this part with just 2 quotes from one of her drafts, again, full of her poetry of form, I think, or exemplary of her poetry of form, stating, "Where we are is how we may move, and what we may see, how near and how clearly. Where we are is how we may not move, and what we cannot see nor envision. Where we are is the essence of architecture, of environmental design. We can do this thing. We can survive and achieve more than survival as life." All right, so a few years later then, June Jordan's His Own Where is published in 1971. It's a coming-of-age novella that delves into the intersections of space, race, and language in urban Brooklyn. And the story follows Buddy Rivers and Angela Figueroa, 2 teenagers navigating oppressive environments and seeking refuge and belonging. And their love story unfolds against a backdrop of adult authority, systemic neglect, and stifling urban landscapes. And through their experiences, Jordan explores how systemic injustices shape lives and communities. It's written entirely in Black vernacular, and the book challenges, in doing so, the book challenges mainstream linguistic norms, offering a counter narrative also of cultural resistance and empowerment. And Jordan's decision to write in Black English actually sparked controversy at the time with some Black parents, fearing it would harm their children's education. Yet for Jordan, this choice was an essential act of cultural and political resistance. And she wrote, and you can see this here in the quote, "I wrote His Own Where as a means of familiarizing kids with activist principles of urban design, or in other words, activist habits of response to environment. I thought to present these ideas with the guise of a Black love story, written entirely in Black English. In these ways, I might hope to interest teenagers in reading it, study alternative urban designs for the promotion of flexible, Pacific, communal street life." And so in His Own Where, June Jordan creates various tropes of space. Oh, I should mention, the story is inspired actually by 2 of her regular students. She had a poetry for the children workshop in Brooklyn, and 2 students inspired this for her to write this story. But the novella itself creates various tropes of space that also serve as structuring elements throughout the narrative. As you can see here, that also structure my chapter. For one, you have the city, which is a central element in the novella, and the metaphor of the city as a hospital. We have Buddy's home, a brownstone home, and his neighborhood as a utopian blueprint for environmental redesign. The school is a site of protest, and a cemetery between tombstones and skyscrapers, a disputable escape. But in what ways do they portray or counter spatial injustice, and how are these physical and imagined spaces alternatively lived and contested by the characters? So seems to be a pattern of a lived experience of the physical space and spatial injustice that can be identified, that is often connected to an imaginary utopian realm of how a particular space could be countered. Now, maybe a few words to the title, because it's an interesting pairing of words, his, own, where. So it symbolizes the protagonist's personal metaphorical search for home, justice, for belonging, and this question word, where, remains an open question throughout the entire narrative. So it incorporates a sense of beginning and ending with what is revealed as his own where, like, as we'll see later on, it's a makeshift tool shed in the cemetery. The narrative centers on this makeshift shelter in the cemetery, representing them both beginning and end, and reflecting the idea that spatial justice must be imagined and created by the individual. What was interesting, the alternative title, A Pad is a Place, which I found out in the archival material, also emphasizes the power of imagination and writing and shaping one's own space. So now I'll be coming to geographers and urban planners' concept of third space. As I explored the idea whether his own where can be read as a third space in and of itself, because the protagonists seem to exist between imagination and action and between spaces of representation as well as representations of space. So Soja defines third space as follows. Third space can be described as a creative recombination and extension, one that builds on a first space perspective that is focused on the real material world, and a second space perspective that interprets this reality through imagined representations of spatiality. And so Steph Meskel-Brocken argues then that Soja's third space theory, which emphasizes moving beyond binaries to understand space as simultaneously real and imagined, provides a valuable framework for recognizing young people as active agents in placemaking, highlighting the need to include their voices and experiences in arts and cultural participation to transcend traditional hierarchies and create more inclusive and dynamic spaces. So he writes the political notion of third space and its significance as a place where space and place can be reimagined and power hierarchies challenges also significance to work that seeks to emancipate communities and encourage deeper engagement in their own spaces and places through artwork and creativity. So, as I mentioned, central to the story is Jordan's exploration of space as both a physical and symbolic element. And Buddy, for example, envisions the city as a hospital. He views the urban landscape as a site of shared care and healing, contrasting with the neglect and systemic failures he witnesses daily. And he writes, Buddy's sure the whole city should be like a hospital and everybody taking turns to heal the people. People turning doctor, patient, nurse. Whole city asking everybody how you are, how you feel, what can I do for you, how can I help? Fantastic if the city turned into a hospital, the city filled with 1 million people asking 1 million other people, how are you feeling? How's everything? What do you need? Policeman make a note, act like a nurse. So the metaphor of the hospital then recurs throughout the novella, with Buddy later describing the city of his people like an all-night emergency room. So the image emphasizes how the urban environment is constantly in crisis, demanding care and transformation. And Buddy counters this experience with words reminiscent of what Bradford Grant calls environmental appropriation of resistance. So Buddy's act of planting seeds in a sterile space, such as his father's hospital room, becomes a poignant act of resistance and renewal, a way of reimagining oppressive spaces, sites of growth and potential. And we see here, Buddy seems to be moving between imagination and action, a third space, so to say. A dream that Buddy has later on broaches also the issue of the New York housing conditions and what to do with the empty skyscrapers and office buildings by night. And through the perspective of his father's drawing pad, he imagines empty office buildings that transform into more dwelling space at night. move on. And yeah, for this presentation, I'm only focusing here on the city and the cemetery. There are other tropes that I'm looking at in the chapter, but one of the central tropes is the cemetery, another significant trope in the novella, among others. I'm sorry, repeating myself, functioning as a paradoxical refuge for Buddy and Angela. It's described as a small Manhattan with tombstones resembling skyscrapers, and it mirrors the urban environment they seek to escape. And this specific quotes creates a circular moment within the novella because it starts with this quote, but it also ends with this quote. It says, "You be different from the dead, all the tombstones tearing up the ground, look like a little city, like a small Manhattan, not exactly. Here is not the same, here you be bigger than the buildings, bigger than the little city. You be really different from the resting other ones. His own where, own place for loving, made for making love, the cemetery, where nobody guard the dead." So the cemetery becomes a space of freedom in the end, where authority is absent and the protagonist can carve out a moment of peace. And Jordan writes here, as you can see, you'd be bigger than the buildings, bigger than the little city, suggesting that even within the confines of oppressive environments, individual can reimagine and resist. And the tool shed here by the cemetery becomes a third space as well, I would argue, as Soja would describe it, as space where reality and imagine intersect, creating opportunities for transformation. So the cemetery, though symbolic of death, becomes a site of life and potential in the end. And with that, maybe the cemetery, the tool shed, Buddy's dreams, and other spaces, they all exemplify this dual critique and reimagining. These spaces become metaphors for Jordan's broader political message, namely that resistance and transformation require both activism and imagination. And it shows once more why discourse of imagined spaces of injustice, with brackets, is especially prevalent in Jordan's texts, because her activist writing between imagination and action so strongly relates to Soja's elaborations of third space. Thus, I suggest Jordan's His Own Where can be read as a third space in and of itself. So to conclude, His Own Where and Skyrise for Harlem show that Jordan continued to raise awareness of the precarious circumstances in marginalized communities that were often stamped as slum or ghetto, and implemented ideas of self-help and activism from the bottom up through architecture made accessible through what she called her poetry of form. And by reimagining environments and reclaiming language, Jordan offers a vision of hope and empowerment for young readers, encouraging them to reshape the spaces they inhabit into sites of justice and healing. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
I'll call back in here in order to call on people. Thank you, Sophia. Fascinating. My first look at that image did go where you ultimately were. It looked like nuclear.
Yeah.
I mean, just in the imagination, at least my generation, that's the first thing I saw. But that's not what they are. No, they're not. I have several questions, but let me open it up first to our good folks in the room. And then online, we're happy to take questions, and I'm reading.
And we do have a couple of questions in the chat.
Good. Anyone here in the room?
So,
Howdy.
I have to admit, I've never even heard of her. Much like the very poetry, and I'm gonna get that book. But, was she able to see any influence at all in the built environment of her poetic vision? Anywhere, even in a room, in a museum, in any place?
Well, there were projects, rather short-lived though, immediately after Skyrise for Harlem was, or instant Slum Clearance in that case was published. So there were attempts to get a community engaged in transforming their neighborhoods and their environments, but on a small scale, and certainly not in a way that Jordan and Fuller envisioned it to that extent. So there were little groups, yes, but yeah, not in the same way. Yeah.
Two quick questions for you. First, is there any symbolism to the number 15 with the conical towers that she proposed?
Was it 15 or 13? I don't think there was a metaphorical significance to the amount of towers. But I think the idea was to create, I think 3 conical towers should make up one kind of building block, and people would be connected by like uplifted walkways. That's what she called like flying islands. So there were these kind of centers, but I don't think there was a specific relevance to the number of towers.
Second is that name change in Esquire. Skyrise for Harlem, which reflected the hope and empowerment that you cited at the end, to instant slum clearance, which designates a doing away with and getting rid of. Have you found any reaction that she had to the name change, and you know, how that kind of fits into this poetic erasure that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's what surprised me the most, as did you. Well, I think Jordan, first of all, was very restricted in what she could do. She voiced her frustration that she had a certain limit, what she could write for this type of article, and she heavily relied on the money that she would get from this article. So I'm assuming that she also had to come up with some sort of agreement, or what made it in the final article. But yeah, it moved entirely away from like the idea of what Baldwin called like this from urban renewal to Negro removal is directly translated into this title change. And what's even more interesting in the glossary in the very beginning of Esquire magazine, where you can read where you can find which article. It's a disclaimer that says Prometheus and Unbound, which is a reference to a drama by Percy Shelley, a closet drama. So indicating it's a play that was never meant to be performed, but only exists in the imagination of those who are reading the script or the drama itself. So stating from the very beginning, this is just a think piece. Don't you get any ideas that this will become reality?
That's her point of view.
That's what
Magazines.
The editors.
the editors.
It's the editors, okay.
Yeah, Jordan fully believed that this could be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's come back to that, but Tom, go
Yeah.
first.
So she is doing this work, and they're both, both of the kind of material of hers that you're citing are just about, thinking about how to envision the urban landscape and especially Harlem and New York. And she's doing it at the same time that Jane Jacobs is also kind of talking about the environment. And they're both kind of benchmarked between the work that Robert Moses is doing throughout just kind of the anti, Jane Jacobs.
Carving the whole place up with fruit.
And then, and on the one hand, and then the kind of, Bronx fires of the 1970s, where landlord, which Ben Ansfield has written about recently, that are, about this other kind of destructive kind of urban renewal in a real kind of dark sense. And how is your project is your project trying to pull in all of that, or is it, more kind of focused, or how do you kind of put her and her work in light of all these other people and events that are really transforming the landscape of New York City.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I'm talking about this within my chapter because this is happening at the same time, exactly the same time as Jane Jacobs and the Lower Manhattan Expressway that Robert Moses is planning to build right through Washington Square Park. But thankfully, that was also never realized, but
But the Cross Bronx Freeway was.
yeah.
That cut off Harlem too.
Yeah, but there you can see, for one, as a Black female writer and as a Black urban planner, because she used to also work as a urban planner herself for mobilization for youth for a period of time, so that influenced her work as well. She was completely misrecognized in this so white male dominated world of urban planning, and had to then also be squeezed into this very neutral sounding, not entirely, but it sounds very neutral, like an architectural report. Not once is it mentioned in the report that June Jordan is an African American. At the time, she was also often referred to still under her married name Meyer, so she'd been married to a white man. So completely sidelined for so many reasons. Yeah.
One other thing to add to that mix, I wonder if she ever references James Weldon Johnson's famous book called Black Manhattan. And I only bring it up because she has, well, you used phrases like Harlem's confinement. It's a space that has borders, and then it becomes a racial border, so on and so on. I don't know if that book ever influenced her, but it was the first of its kind. And Johnson writes that in 1930, so he doesn't even live long enough to see the poverty that developed in Harlem. He celebrates all these Black developers who finally got into Harlem and started buying up properties. Some of them got quite rich on it. And he, of course, celebrates the cultural flower. He never calls it the Harlem Renaissance, but he celebrates the cultural flowering of Harlem. But that is only up to 1930. I just want, but June Jordan is writing, thinking, and designing 35 years later, a whole different generation. I just wondered if she ever referenced him. I'm also really struck here, I don't know what to do with it, you will, her utopianism. Just where do you think that comes from? In her training, in her imagination? Does she ever, from your research, does she ever reflect on that? Does she have a favorite utopian writer, or for that matter, designer? I mean, architects can be quite utopian.
There she is working with Buckminster Fuller.
Yeah, working with him,
Yeah.
literally
Yeah.
doing the work, creating work together. And then you did mention here, she's writing this for money. An artist has to make a living. I mean, these are biographical questions, I guess, but they're fascinating. Those cones, funnels, whatever, towers, it almost made me even think of some of the imagination one sees at Disney World. I'm serious, that Disney World had all this imagined future. It was always, that's when it was born, in fact, of that Cold War imagined future, including one that I've only been there once because my nephews made me go. But you actually ride a kind of car up through this tower, you know, and that was created possibly even before 65, I'm not sure. Anyway, she's on some kind of cutting edge here of utopian architecture, and I wonder who she's drawing on. Is there even a tradition of Black utopianism? I don't know, or just American utopianism, some other form. I've got other questions too, but that doesn't matter. We've got some good questions coming online.
Yeah, I'm trying to answer as much as I can.
Anything or
I'm
nothing?
not sure
It's
I'll
up to you.
have an answer for everything.
That's quite all right.
But one of the main reasons why I have in the title, looking back to June Jordan, is kind of a play on words, because June Jordan herself continuously looked back to African American writers. And she wrote like essays, think pieces, and poetry about Langston Hughes and Phyllis Wheatley,
Really?
Walt Whitman. So she's
Dunbar, maybe?
Edward Johnson, yeah, James Weldon Johnson, I'm not sure, but
Yeah,
there is a
yeah.
seemingly a tendency within her work that I at least found out, that she always engages in a looking back to other writers. That I then also found in Rankin's work in Citizen, which I'm working on now. There's always this sense of looking back in time, but also a sense of looking back with questioning the white male gaze and the idea of the oppositional gaze, but that's another point. But if Black Manhattan necessarily was an influence, I don't have an exact
May not,
reference.
but it was the first attempt by anybody to like write a history of how Black New York evolved.
Yeah.
And then finally into Harlem. I mean, he writes the book in 2930, right after the flowering of the 20s. He's gone.
I have to look into that.
It's worth a read to see if you see any resonance.
I mean, what I would say where there is a parallel is between His Own Where and John Dos Passos' Manhattan Transfer, because His Own Where is written in a very modernist stream of consciousness way, that where the city itself is given agency. So yes, there are protagonists.
The city's a character.
The city's a character. So we have Buddy and Angela as characters, but New York City itself is basically the not even silent protagonist in this.
No, New York's not silent.
No. Yeah.
Sorry.
Very loud protagonist.
Should we take some of the online?
Go ahead, you want to read?
Sure.
Go ahead.
So we have a question. Are there connections between June Jordan and Malcolm X in terms of reimagining Harlem's physical spaces and spaces of memory?
I'm just taking a few notes. I don't remember.
He eventually lived there.
Well, the only connection I can make, as I mentioned before, sorry, thank you for your question, is to the Black Power movement, in that she directly mentions in a letter this fourth point of the Black Panthers 10-point program for decent housing fit for human beings. I believe she also engaged with Malcolm X in some capacity. I'm sure I'm just not, I have to admit, I couldn't give you a fully satisfactory answer, unfortunately, but she was, of course, also heavily influenced by Martin Luther King, and shortly after his assassination, but then also after Langston Hughes' death, she was really moved, I think, to then turn to the page and use writing as a form of protest.
She knew Hughes really well.
Well, she took over his Who Look at Me was supposed to be a project by Langston Hughes. And he passed away in the early beginnings, and then the Association of American Poets, is that correct? Suggested June Jordan could take over this project.
Go ahead.
So quick question, is it possible to read Jordan's original drafts, and where can they be found?
the drafts are at the Radcliffe Institute, actually, at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard University. I made scans, so I had to like work hard with it. My supervisor in the beginning was quite skeptical. How do I want to make a full chapter out of the two-page utopian like redesign article? But if you look at the drafts, they're like make up like 15 pages or so to give you a scale of how much has actually been cut down.
Oh,
But they're at the archive. Some of it, I think, is even here at Yale.
Beinecke does have some June
Yeah,
papers.
yeah. Like a few things, but the drafts I've been referring to are at Harvard.
And then the last online question is a comment. There's documentation that June was irate at the title change of the article as it was incredibly offensive. And then this person's question is why you've chosen to call her erasure poetic. I find that glorifies the violence of erasure. I'm not sure that's what you're saying, that her erasure is poetic. When you say use the term poetic erasure, can you just elaborate what you mean by that?
Oh, that's not necessarily what I meant, I think. And maybe I'd be grateful if you have a different term to come up with it. But what I was trying to counter Madeline's notion of rhetorical erasure of Harlem that he accuses Jordan of doing in Skyrise for Harlem. I would argue against that and saying her poetic voice was erased from the final article. So does that make it any clearer? Maybe it's,
I think that's clear.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
And
Can I ask
they
a-
could write
a
to
kind
you
of-
if they want. You have.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah,
I'll
please write
post your
to me.
email
Please
address.
write to me,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I'm happy for like suggestions.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Something you just touched on as part of that poetic erasure that happened on the publication of the article. I think you said that like a sense of collectivity was erased. Can you say more about that? I was wondering, like, in their vision for this, future of Harlem, her and Buckminster Fuller, how much were they connected to the community? It sort of comes across, certainly in the illustrations, as a top-down kind of, an architectural approach where the designers are kind of removed from the community itself and deciding what's best.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's not where she was coming from, but I wonder how her existing connections with the community kind of were incorporated into
Yeah.
her vision.
Yeah, so for example, what was edited out is that Skyrise for Harlem should be an opportunity for creating jobs for people where everyone could contribute. So the idea of like job creation through this kind of project, then youth or Harlem youth should also be involved by planting trees, for example, giving them like a purpose within this within the construction or like redesign. What else is there? Like she wanted to, I think, strengthen also a new middle class, hoping that students from strengthening a new middle class, hoping that Black students from Columbia University and artists would move specifically then into these new apartments and into like Skyrise to kind of also not only work with people who already live and are affected by the state of that Harlem was in at the time, but also to get more people on board and also create a new and strengthened community. And I think the pronoun we is something so strong in the drafts. She constantly refers to like, we can do this. It's like, it's on us. And that's what I meant with the communities, also including herself within that community, which I'm not sure if that is completely coming through in the final article. And that's what I meant. Like, this is just a few examples in the sense of community that I thought made the draft sound so powerful. But
So your chapter is gonna be as much about the archival draft as it is about the published piece, or both.
it's a bit of both, yeah.
I was really struck at the metaphor, I believe it's in His Own Where, 1971, of the city as hospital. That's her idea,
Well, that's,
And
yeah,
characters.
the character
but
idea.
that's a fascinating idea. Hospitals are a place of caring, and they don't always feel that way if you're an inmate or a patient, but
Yeah, yeah.
they are a place of caring. We don't think of cities that way. She seems to have wanted, I mean, she not only seems to have believed architecture itself can heal, improve people, improve their class mobility, their whole social mobility. But cities can be made places that improve people, heal people. That's still what people want of their cities, even though our cities have become such places of drastic inequality. I don't know, it's just, and the fact that this is 1960s imagination. I wish you all the luck in the world with this, because this is a different side of the 60s. You know, yeah, the Black Panthers had some utopian ideas, they did. Civil rights movement had, some people might say, had some modestly utopian ideas. They were going to change America. They did. But here's an architect and a fiction writer and a poet who says, somehow I can combine all three of those and make a city better live. You know,
It really reminds me of today's, abolitionist geographies. Do you know Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work?
Yeah, she's also just in a few articles mentioned in commenting to about Jordan's work as well.
yeah, Tom.
It also brings to mind the Harlem Hospital, which has been
Yeah,
in Harlem since the 30s. It's full of
even before.
New Deal era
Paul was born there.
artwork. Yeah, it's right across the street from the Schomburg, or
Yeah.
close,
It's right up the street.
it's right, and it's really is kind of a focal point of that, part of Harlem, which is kind of really significant. So have you had a chance to visit Harlem?
Sorry,
Have you visited Harlem?
I have, yeah,
Oh,
I
good,
have.
good.
I've been there.
Okay.
Yeah, of course,
You've done some walking tours.
I have,
Good.
I have.
There are a lot of tours in Harlem.
Yes, I have.
Oh.
But yeah, I also read up a little bit on like the precarity of healthcare in hospitals during the 1960s, and how that is reflected in His Own Where, and the cramped conditions. So the city, like an all-night emergency room, like there were cramped emergency room, but his father, who had an accident, is in a semi-private hospital room. So there are all these little bits and pieces that give you an insight into probably also the reality of what it actually looked like in hospitals at the time.
It evokes a little bit of James McBride's work today too. I don't know if you know the author James McBride, but he writes almost a kind of urban science fiction about Black life, neighborhoods, and cities, and communities. I wonder if Jim Jordan is one of his influences. All of this is amazing, fascinating. Are there any other comments from out on the
I think that's
online world?
I think that's it for right now.
Well, we've pretty well run out, it's almost 1:15. Sophia, thank you for launching our Wednesdays at lunch is fantastic, lots to think about. And anybody who is online and wants to write to Sophia about any of your thoughts,
I've posted the,
her email is there. You may regret that we're giving out your email. But thank you all for coming, and
Thank you so much. for
especially
the-
Sophia, thank you to you, and thanks to everybody in the room.
Yeah.
And